Bill introductions, any bills? Seeing none, we'll move on. Before we start our hearings, I want the conferees to know that everyone's going to have to be brief. We have 4 hearings today, and do not read your testimony. We already have that we can read, so very brief. With that, we're going to open a hearing on House Bill 2551, Joint Committee on Special Claims Against the State, making appropriations, authorizing certain transfers, authorizing certain disbursements. We'll have a staff overview with Merle Riedel, Legislative Research Department. Merle, welcome committee.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman. My name is Merle Riedel. I'm a fiscal analyst with Legislative Research. I'll provide an overview of House Bill 2551. I am going to be looking from a TAN document that you should have in front of you. This memo generally describes the amount that was claimed, the circumstances, and the recommendations of the Joint Committee on Special Claims Against the State, and that recommendation is often partial payment for less than the amount that was requested. Looking down on the first page, you'll see the Joint Committee on Special Claims Against the State recommends payment of claims that would total $49,342, including $1,759 from the State General Fund. All claims except for motor fuel tax refunds are directed to be paid from existing resources in fiscal year FY 2024 and would not increase total expenditures. Moving down on that page, you'll see on Section 2, pages 1 through 3 of the bill, the Joint Committee's recommendation totals $245.53 from the Kansas Department of Corrections. That includes payment for 6 claims, all from existing resources. Those claims generally relate to loss of inmate property, and the amounts recommended for payment range from $16 to $118. Moving on to the second page in your memo, you'll see Section 3 on page 2 of the bill. The Joint Committee recommendation totals $1,514, all from the Larned State Hospital. Those include payments for 2 claims. The first claim is Anthony Mott seeks $1,508 in compensation for damages to his 2018 Nissan Rogue sustained in a collision with an agency forklift. The agency does not dispute the collision, but notes that the claimant later collided with a deer and was compensated by his personal insurance for the total loss of the vehicle. The claimant subsequently provided documentation substantiating the damages from the forklift collision were deducted from the insurance settlement, and the Joint Committee recommended full payment of that claim. The next item you'll see for the Larned State Hospital is Valdy Barnett seeks $5.42 for a television channel guide magazine. The resident states was withheld by agency staff for 3 months, which rendered the magazine's contents irrelevant. The committee recommends full payment of that claim for $5.42. Moving down on page 2 of your memo is Section 4, page 2. The Joint Committee recommends $2,000, all from the Kansas Department of Wildlife and Parks, for a claim from Martin Goodwin, who seeks $3,956 for damages to his 1997 Jeep Cherokee, 1994 Ford F-150, and a camping chair sustained from a falling tree at a Clinton State Park campsite. The agency confirmed the fallen tree, but disputes the claim by noting the vehicle damages were inconsistent with photographs of the accident scene. The Joint Committee recommends partial payment of that claim for a total of $2,000. Moving down on the memo, you'll see Section 5, pages 2 through 3 of the bill. The Joint Committee recommendation includes $45,582 from the Kansas Department of Revenue's Motor Vehicle Fuel Tax Refund Fund. Refund requests must be received by the Department of Revenue within 1 year. After that period, the claim must be filed with the Joint Committee. Refunds are allowed for taxes that are generally paid on fuel used on off-highway purposes or aspects such as buses and farming. Section 6 on page 3 of the bill would require claimants to sign a release attesting satisfaction of the claim prior to issue of payment. And Section 4 simply notes the bill would become effective upon publication in the Kansas Register. Mr. Chairman, I can stand for questions.
Thank you, Merle. Any questions for Merle? Seeing none, thank you, Merle. Are there any proponents for this bill? Seeing none. Opponents? Seeing none. Neutral? Seeing none. We will close our hearing on House Bill 2551. Next, we'll open the hearing on House Bill 2491, abolishing the Law Enforcement Training Center Fund. All liabilities of such fund are transferred to be imposed on the state's general fund. Monies previously credited to such fund shall be credited to the state general fund. I have a staff overview with David Weiss, Officer Revisor. David, welcome committee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, committee. Yes, House Bill 2491 would abolish the Law Enforcement Training Center Fund. Under the bill, all receipts and assessments that were being credited to the Law Enforcement Training Fund would now be credited to the State General Fund. And then on July 1, 2024, all monies in the fund would be transferred to the State General Fund, and the Law Enforcement Training Center Fund is abolished on that date. So this would effectively mean that the State General Fund is now going to be supporting the Law Enforcement Training Center. So the House made no amendments to House Bill 2491 and passed the bill by a vote of 122-0 on March 14, 2024. I can stand for any questions.
Thank you, David. Questions? Seeing none. Thank you, David. Next, we'll have proponents. We'll have Darren Beck, Kansas Law Enforcement Training Center. Darren, welcome committee.
Can you hear me now? Okay. I appreciate that, Mr. Chair. I wanted to appear today for primarily one purpose, and that's this bill does abolish the Kansas Law Enforcement Training Center Fund. It does not fund the Kansas Law Enforcement Training Center. So it will require another action on your part in the event that you would want to see the Kansas Law Enforcement Training Center continue to exist, and I'm hopeful that you do want to see us continue to exist. So I appreciate your support throughout this process, transferring our funding from fee-based to general fund. Thank you.
Are there questions for Darren? Senator Pittman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for being here and testifying. Just curious why we wouldn't increase the fee and keep it as a fee-based piece versus having all the fees go into the general fund and then having us use general funds, since fees are a carve out for your budget in future years, and it keeps it very, very safe. This opens up to some uncertainty as you move into that process. So I'm just wondering, is it just because you don't want to raise fees, or is there some other reason?
Mr. Beck.
So we don't really, I don't want to say we don't care, but we defer to the legislature as to the appropriate funding source. It was the House leadership that suggested that we move into a different funding source. I think one of the concerns is as we continue to grow as an organization, fees, it becomes much more, a much bigger increase in the fees every time we make a request for an increase in our funding. And so there was not an appetite for that large of an increase in fees.
Other questions? Seeing none, thank you, Mr. Beck.
Thank you.
Next, we'll have the Sheriff Jeffrey Easter from Sedgwick County on WebEx. Sheriff, are you there?
I am, sir. Thank you.
Go ahead if you'd like to.
There we go. Well, good morning, Chairman Billinger and committee members. I appreciate the opportunity to speak to you today to make it very quick and succinct. The KLETC puts on training for all law enforcement in the state of Kansas, and they do an excellent job. I know that the current way that they're funded is suspect because the amount of tickets and those type of things are way down across the state. So it makes their funding mechanism much more vulnerable. The KSA believes that this particular formatting of budget gives them a better chance of being successful. And so we support KLETC in this venture. And with that, I'll take any questions.
Thank you, Sheriff Easter. Any questions? Seeing none, thank you for being here today.
Thank you.
Are there any other proponents for this bill? Seeing none, are there any opponents? Any neutrals? Seeing none, we'll close our hearing on House Bill 2491. Senator Petty.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. So do we have any kind of a fiscal note that shows how much money came in last year through these fines or these fees that are connected to the different sources, and how it's been decreasing?
There's a,
This is the first page.
there is from Budget Director Profit, and I guess you can read that on your own.
So, and according to this, according to the University of Kansas, they're going to receive 7.5 million and expend approximately 10.2. It doesn't really show that it's been going down, but so I'm going to make this assumption that, and it shows that they see that their costs are going to be increasing to 12 million in 25. Is that correct? And then 12.4 in 26?
Correct.
So now these fees, this amount, this 7.5, well, the amount of money that comes from the fees will be going directly to the state general fund, and then we will, our state of Kansas, from our state general fund, will be expending these amounts, this amount of projected funding. Is that correct? We'll have to look for that in our budget?
That's the way this is at this time. We're not working the bill today, but.
Understood. I just wanted to ask that question. Thank you.
Any other questions? Seeing none, we'll close our hearing. Next, we'll open our hearing on Senate Bill 552, enacting the Kansas Campus Restoration Act to address deferred maintenance and demolition of facilities at post-secondary educational institutions, establishing the Kansas Campus Restoration Fund in the state treasury, and authorizing certain transfers from the state general fund for such a fund. We'll start out with a staff overview with David Weiss, Officer Revisor. David.
Thank you again, Mr. Chairman. Senate Bill 552 would create 8 new sections of law to be known as the Kansas Campus Restoration Act. So Section 1 just names the act and establishes the purpose of the act is to reduce deferred maintenance of educational mission critical facilities at post-secondary educational institutions, bring those facilities to a state of good repair, and then also provide for any demolition or razing of facilities that are no longer mission critical. There's also definitions of terms used throughout the act. You know, the post-secondary educational institution, state educational institution. Section 2 establishes the Kansas Campus Restoration Fund in the Treasury. The fund would be administered by the Board of Regents. Deferred maintenance accounts of the fund would be established for each post-secondary educational institution for the purpose of making capital improvement expenditures. Expenditures from the fund would require a dollar for dollar match from either the post-secondary educational institution or private monies, but there are exceptions for expenditures for community colleges, technical colleges, or a municipal university, or expenditures for demolition or raising of buildings and facilities at state educational institutions would not require the match. And then the fund also retains interest earnings. Section 3 would establish a transfer of $32.7 million annually from the state general fund to the Kansas Campus Restoration Fund. This transfer would begin July 1st, 2025, or in fiscal year 2026, and then end July 1, 2035. So it would be fiscal 26 through fiscal 36, an annual transfer. And then Section 4 requires the post-secondary educational institutions to develop and submit to the Board of Regents a plan for the purpose of rehabilitating, remodeling, or renovating existing facilities or building new facilities that are educational mission critical, and to bring those facilities to a state of good repair. The plan shall also include a list of facilities for demolition, if any. The plan would be subject to approval by the Board of Regents. And then the Board of Regents would also be required to develop a comprehensive campus restoration plan based on all of those individual plans submitted. The Kansas State University Polytech campus in Salina and the University of Kansas Edwards campus in Overland Park shall not be excluded from direct participation in the plan. And the plan shall encourage and the board may require a reduction in total campus square footage in a project associated with such plan. So then in section 5, it then required the Board of Regents to distribute an aggregate amount of $30 million beginning in fiscal 26 through fiscal 36 from the fund to each state educational institution's deferred maintenance account in accordance with the plan developed and approved by the board. So these would be the big 6 universities would get that, would distribute the $30 million would be distributed by the Board of Regents. And then beginning also in 26 through 36, the board would credit $100,000 in each year to each community college, technical college, and municipal university account. And then section 6 of the bill provides that the Board of Regents authority to adopt rules and regulations to administer the act, and then also requires a definition of educational mission critical facilities and state of good repair. That definition of state of good repair would be presented to the Joint Committee on State Building Construction for review and comment. And then section 7 requires the board to submit annual reports on the progress of the plan to the Senate Ways and Means Committee, House Appropriations Committee, House Higher Education Budget Committee, and the Joint Committee on State Building Construction. And then finally, section 8 of the bill does establish a sunset date of the act, July 1st, 2036. And I can take any questions, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, David. Questions? Senator Pittman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I just read ahead, and since you're here, I want to ask a question. There's an educational building fund already in existence, isn't there?
That's correct, yes.
And is that redundant with this fund at all, or is this in any sense?
I mean, I think it could be in addition to the educational building fund. That's based on property tax, the mill levy that's levied, and this would be an SGF transfer each year. So
They would be technically different in how we could use those funds? Is that the main difference, or is the educational building fund not available for the same kind of stuff?
Well, I think it would be available, but this would be specifically for the deferred maintenance and any potential demolition costs. So I mean, they could be the same, but this one's more specific to the deferred maintenance.
So this one would have, just one last one, this one would have very specific specifications where the building fund has a more generalized nature to it.
Yeah, that would be correct.
Thank you.
That's obviously, and that's obviously subject to legislative,
Senator Pittman, I might mention, this is a similar bill to what we had last year, except instead of the $300 million up front, this spreads it over 11 years, which we've been doing the last 4 years. We've been putting 30, 40 million in every year to do this. This is in addition to the mill. The mill brings in about 50 million. There's over $1 billion in deferred maintenance. So this is to let the universities plan and, set up maintenance. So other questions for David? Seeing none, thank you, David. Next, we'll start out with proponents. We'll start out with Blake Flanders, President and CEO of the Kansas Board of Regents. Blake, welcome committee.
Thank you, Chair Billinger, members of the committee, and thank you for the opportunity to appear to testify in support of 552, and thank you for your partnership. The board developed a deferred maintenance plan, a facility renewal plan, and really was, I think, alarmed at the amount of deferred maintenance that are on our campuses. It's a facility-intensive industry. We have over 1,000 buildings. A number of those are mission critical, almost 500, and require, obviously, maintenance money to keep those facilities in good use and ready for students to learn. In terms of the total, the industry standard is about 2% of the total value of the buildings is needed for maintenance. That's it's 2 to 4%, but we've put it at 2%. So if you look at the total footprint, that would be about 180 million when you graduate into that. at present day dollars, would be what's required at 2%. What we're doing is we're stepping into that. So the first year we paid a quarter, second year a half. I believe we're at 0.75% for this next year of that 180 million. And so how does that work? It requires really 3 funding streams. It's a 3-legged stool, and without one of those, it doesn't work. We have the Education Building Fund, we have the investment from the State General Fund, and then we also have the investment from the universities. So the last couple of years, we've invested $258 million into deferred maintenance and into tear down of facilities. 73 million, a little over 73 million came from the State General Fund, 91 million from the Education Building Fund, and 93.5 million from the universities. And so it's going to be important to require that match also as we go forward. We also need to reduce the size of our footprint. We've got 20 buildings in the pipeline for tear down. That's going to reduce 80 million of deferred maintenance. And we have a goal there to reduce about 250 million of deferred maintenance over time. We don't just want to put out a list of the buildings that are on the list for tear down, because there needs to be quite a bit of communication before you announce that you're going to tear down a facility. So we are in full support of this legislation, other than I just bring up one thing. The coordinated institutions. Coordinated institutions are governed by a local board, and that includes Washburn and the community colleges. The community colleges have a ad valorem local tax that's getting close to 300 million. Those local boards are responsible for those facilities. So I would recommend that instead of us going in and doing those plans and approving all those plans, we don't have the staff capacity right now to do that. That perhaps their local boards come up with a plan and then present that to the legislature in terms of what's happened with their facilities. I would suggest some common things for Washburn University as well, because those local boards have been in charge of those plans. So with that, I'd stand for any questions.
Thank you, Blake. Questions? Senator McGinn.
So I was just trying to catch up and see how many projects you have listed, but I could just, it seems like a pretty big list. And so as you tear these down in landlocked university campuses, I could see the temptation that we're going to build back. And I just want to know for sure if you guys have ever implemented the, I build a building in my name, and part of that donation is going to take care of the deferred maintenance in the future. Because I know that I've asked for that for 20 years, and it seems like perhaps maybe it finally happened. I'm not sure. So could you please answer that?
Yeah, so the with the plan, if you add square footage to your footprint, it goes into your current replacement value. And so you're responsible by policy for that investment. So before someone would give to a building, it's real difficult for, actually that maintenance is an incredibly high price if you look at it over time. So it doesn't attract investment. We don't have very many people saying, I'd like to pay for the water heater, or I'd like to, pay for the replacement roof. They generally, the investment wants to come for newer buildings or new additions. So we have put that into the current replacement value so that is now there, as opposed to just allowing someone to say, well, we'll pay for it out of existing resources, and then it doesn't happen. So that's in policy.
Senator McGinn.
I want to make sure I understand. So the building I want to give to you is $1 million, but you're going to tell me that I need to give 1.2 million because I need to build in maintenance.
I'm not going to tell you that. What I'm going to say is, by policy, the university is responsible for that maintenance.
Well, I would have hoped that the with this and everything else that we've done on deferred maintenance, that eventually we would see that dollar amount go down over time. But otherwise, we're just going to have more buildings come on as the years go by that we're going to have to address.
So I would tell you in the last 2 years, the dollar amount would have come down, except the amount of inflation we've been dealing with. So if we had done nothing over this last 2 years, that dollar amount, I haven't calculated what it would be, but it would be incredibly high just because of the level of inflation with construction that we've seen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Other questions, Senator Petty?
Thank you. So you mentioned, and thank you, Dr. Flanders, for being here. You mentioned in your testimony about not wanting to have the community college or Washburn staff to come to the Board of Regents because they have their own boards in place. So I noticed, so does that mean that, looking at the bill, would that change, would that be an amendment to Section 4, or is it Section 6, or both?
I believe it's Section 6, but that would be an amendment we would support. So right now, we don't have the staff. We have one architect. We don't have the staff capacity to go in and do a deferred maintenance analysis. So the first thing we had to do at the universities is a huge project, is you had to say, how much deferred maintenance do you actually have, and are we counting it the same across campuses? You think about your own home. Somebody might say, well, I think this home needs repair, and somebody else might say, well, I think it's okay. So you have to have a standard. We have to have that standard across, I'm just 19 plus Washburn, and then go in and actually do all that work, and we don't have the staff capacity to do that. If you wanted to add tremendous staff capacity at the state, you could do that, but I don't think that that's necessary because those local boards have traditionally been in charge of that. And, I think it might be more effective, you'd have to determine that, but more effective to just have them report to the legislature and say, here's where we've been with this investment. We do several other reports that way.
Okay.
Other questions? Senator Alley.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I noticed in here we had 100,000 per community college in Washburn. Is that what I read in here?
That's what I read, yes.
Yeah. And so what if from a community college in Washburn says, we really need more money, is there any method to move that money around so they could receive more money for their deferred maintenance also?
That would be up to the legislature.
In the $37 million a year that we're giving, would there be room to help the community colleges with that?
So right now, this bill calls for 100,000. The community colleges have traditionally, I think, if you had presidents come up, have used their local ad valorem, which is right now, I think it's close to 300 million for facilities, or some of that has went towards facilities. So this would be additional state investment paired with that local tax. But the reason that, so if we put in 100,000, which is an incredibly small investment when you look at the full footprint, that's why I think those local boards would want to have more authority there, because they could say, hey, we're putting in all this local ad valorem into our facility footprint. You're putting a small investment, yet you're wanting to control our plan. So my thought was they would continue to plan locally and then just report out how that investment was utilized and what they're doing to address their own deferred maintenance needs. I don't believe the legislation allows the board to move money.
Thank you. Other questions? Seeing none, thank you, Blake. Next, we'll have Heather Morgan, Kansas Association of Community Colleges. Heather, welcome to committee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm Heather Morgan, Executive Director of the Kansas Community College Association. We stand in strong support of Senate Bill 552. As you all were just discussing, this bill would give every community college $100,000 each. President Flanders mentioned we had $300 million that was going to buildings. That's not quite right. We have $300 million roughly in local property taxes. Over a third of that is at one institution, Johnson County Community College, but that's entire operating funds, not just for buildings. We have done a very good job of taking care of our buildings across our system because we don't build new buildings every year. We have the same buildings we had in 1960, and we're mostly using money to, quite frankly, make them ADA accessible. We have some bathrooms that just definitely are not up to the standard that we need. And so this money would help us do some renovations that we need, continue to upkeep old buildings. We're very careful not to bring new buildings onto our footprint because of the increased maintenance costs. Some of our buildings are also metal buildings, which we've had to do some renovations for from a power perspective for some of the big technical training tools. While we support this bill, we would request 2 amendments, one in Section 4 and one in Section 6, that have to do with the coordinated institutions. Our local elected boards have 5-year capital improvement plans. We know sort of what we need to be doing in terms of when roofs are going to need to be replaced and those sorts of things. We would ask that our boards just use their 5-year capital improvement plans and report to the legislature progress on making sure that we don't collect deferred maintenance and take care of anything that's existing. In Section 6, it talks about rules and regulations, and I think if we're taking the coordinated institutions out of reporting to KBOR and reporting strictly to the legislature, you don't necessarily need to have us in the rules and regulations process either. But with those 2 amendments, I think this bill goes a long way towards ensuring that property taxpayers in 18 counties aren't being burdened with the entire cost of deferred maintenance and maintenance of critical training facilities in the state, and it sort of spreads the cost, not only just those 18 counties. With that, I'm happy to stand for any questions.
Thank you, Heather. Questions? Senator Petty.
Heather, thanks for being here. And I know that, that we have written only testimony from the president of Washburn, and she mentions about Washburn Tech. So does this bill actually leave out Washburn Tech?
I hope not. I think that they're going to get 100,000 and Washburn would also get 100,000.
Correct. And we have a technical amendment when we get ready to work the bill to fix that.
Thank you.
Other questions? Seeing none. Heather, I guess just for everyone's information, so this 100,000 hopefully would offset local property tax. Hopefully, maybe they could lower their property taxes.
Yes,
The
I would
idea
hope
behind
so.
this. So,
Yes.
any other questions? Seeing none. Thank you,
Thank you.
Heather. Next, we'll have Colton Gibson, University Contractors Association of Kansas. Colton, welcome to committee.
Good morning, Chairman Billinger, members of the committee. My name is Colton Gibson. Thank you for allowing the University Contractors Association of Kansas to offer testimony in support of Senate Bill 552 to establish the Kansas Campus Restoration Act. This act directly addresses Kansas's second largest liability on the books following KPERS, deferred maintenance on state universities. As you've heard from many others before me, the state university system has over 1,130 facilities comprising of 38 million square feet, covering 28,000 acres. 50% of those facilities are mission critical, and half of those mission critical facilities in the system are over 50 years old. In statute, the EBF is used for construction, reconstruction, equipment, and repair of mission-critical buildings and grounds. Remaining stable for many decades, this fund has been at least 1 mil since 1955, as it provides a minimum baseline for the most mission-critical work year to year for our state's largest infrastructure footprint. That said, the footprint of the universities has grown at a greater rate than the mill levy has, which has a small, steady growth year over year. The findings of the Board of Regents issued Facilities Condition Assessment in 2021 showed that the estimated maintenance backlog for mission-critical buildings, commonly referred to as EBF eligible, was nearly $1.3 billion. That number represents the cost to repair and bring the aforementioned mission-critical facilities to a B rating. We have certainly chipped away at this number over the last few years due to your support of one-time funding. Thank you for that. At a 1,000-foot view, thinking strategically about how we can actually address this $1.3 billion problem, KBOR implemented the new goal of investing 2% of a building's overall value back into maintenance each year. In order to accomplish this goal, it's going to take a team effort from all parties. It's going to take the EBF, it's going to take additional support from Legislature, and it's going to take team effort from KBOR and the universities. Senate Bill 552, the Kansas Campus Restoration Act, is more than just a bill. It's a meaningful concept to solve a significant and ever-growing quandary. If we push this down the road, we are going to be paying even more later. Looking at the bigger picture, SB 552 provides the necessary resources for KBOR and university staff to plan, design, and address the deferred maintenance backlog strategically, as opposed to the patchwork system that's been in place. As an example of this, Emporia testified to the State Building Committee back in December that the new systems that they've put in place have actually saved them and continues to save them each month on their utility bills. The Senate Ways and Means Committee knows better than any that we in this building, both state employees and lobbyists alike, should focus on thoughtful, long-term solutions when presented with a problem as significant as we are discussing today. Our members and organizations stand in support of Senate Bill 552 and the Kansas Campus Restoration Act. Thank you for your time and consideration. Mr. Chair, I stand for questions.
Questions for Colton? Seeing none, thank you, Colton. Committee, we also have written only from President Julianne Mazachek at Washburn University. Are there any other proponents for this bill? Seeing none, opponents? Neutral? We'll close our hearing on Senate Bill 552. We'll now open our hearing on Senate Bill 542, making appropriations for the Kansas Department of Aging and Disability Services for fiscal year 2025 and creating a program for cities and counties to improve and develop infrastructure for homeless shelters. We'll start out with the staff overview with Jesse Pringle, Office of Revisor Statute. Jesse, welcome committee.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good morning, committee. I'm Jesse with the Revisor's Office. So Senate Bill 542 appropriates $40 million from the State General Fund to the Kansas Department for Aging and Disability Services to administer a program intended to address homeless shelter infrastructure. And then that would be pursuant to the Section 2. And Section 2 would be the statutory section that creates the requirements for the use of those dollars and requirements on those recipients of the dollars. So Section 2 establishes this grant program to award funds to Kansas local governments for the building of or capital improvements to congregate and non-congregate shelters. These shelters are to be providing services for homeless individuals and families and persons at risk of homelessness. This is only for fiscal year 2025, so this appropriation is for 2025, and therefore this section then only applies in 2025 as well. So the department awards grants to local governments who are required to propose a building plan or improvement plan for the congregate or non-congregate shelter that provides the services. Those shelters are to provide wraparound services to homeless individuals and families. They are required to collect data that's required by the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. They shall prioritize long-term wraparound services for persons who are Kansas residents or have a proof of presence in the state of Kansas for 8 consecutive months. Provide long-term wraparound services, prioritized for Kansas residents. And then the last requirement is that they enforce any local ordinances regarding camping and vagrancy if the local government has them. So the funding awarded is required to be matched by that local government on a dollar-for-dollar basis. And then this also provides a section that if the local government misuses or fails to use or fails to meet the requirements such as enforcing the camping and vagrancy ordinances a local government may have, or fail to provide any of the services that are, in the requirements, then the Department of Aging has the ability to take those funds back and be paid back by that local government, or if those funds have been used, it also gives them the power to file a lien on the property that the funds were used for. So that is a mechanism for the Department of Aging and Disabilities for the accountability of the funds. And then the last section just establishes a fund in the state treasury for the program. and that's Senate Bill 542, and I'm available for questions.
Thank you, Jesse. Questions? Senator Petty.
Thank you. So Jesse, you mentioned that that this is one-time funding. And also, so then section 2 that you just went over in detail is only in place for 1 year.
So Section 2 doesn't have an explicit expiration date in the statutory language, but it only applies to this money that's being appropriated for the fiscal 2025 year.
Okay, so it only applies to the money that's being appropriate. So like, for example, number 6, when it says enforce local ordinance regarding camping and vagrancy. So if they don't have them, is it, then it has no meaning? Does number 6 have no meaning if a city does not have any local ordinances regarding camping and vagrancy? Or is it just implied that they have to?
If the local government has not enacted any local ordinances regarding camping and vagrancy, they're not required to enforce them since they don't have them.
Thank you.
Other questions for Jesse? Senator Pittman.
I just want to confirm, it looks like the money can be appropriated for a building plan or improvement plan, but it could also be used, could it be used as a temporary thing? The unified government has a testimony that's probably written only about one-time usage for heating shelters during the cold snaps we've had where it went below zero. Could it be used for those services if they've met those requirements?
Yes, if it's infrastructure or a capital improvement to existing infrastructure, and it's congregate or non-congregate, then it would apply.
Mr. Chair.
Senator Pittman.
If it sounds like they open up non-permanent structures to do this as a service, so it wouldn't necessarily be going to improve any kind of physical structure. Would that money still be available to them to use for that kind of purpose as it's a temporary like reallocation for a church, community center for a heating shelter for 3 weeks?
Yeah, I would say that is a question of whether or not that is infrastructure as in the bill, and that would be up to the Department of Aging and Disability Services if that qualifies.
Other questions? Senator Fagg.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for your presentation. You know, I looked at this $40 million number, and it's a one-for-one match. There's probably a lot of communities that might have trouble matching on that. So was there any discussion in that area? And the second one is that, is there any kind of lid on one community getting half of it, you know, and the other guys, I'm concerned about that part of it too. So, because this problem is everywhere. You know, I can name you 3 or 4 cities that's got this problem. So just wondered if you wanted to talk about that a little bit.
Sure. Yes. So Senate Bill 542 mirrors House Bill 2723. And so that bill has had a hearing in House Welfare Reform. That bill has yet to be worked. But some of the testimony regarding House Bill 2723 did speak to smaller communities and doing certain percentages for those smaller communities. The bill, Senate Bill 542, currently does not have the limit on how much a local government may receive, nor does it have any sort of requirement on who and what type of local government shall receive funds.
Other questions? Seeing none, thank you, Jesse. We'll start out with our proponents. We'll start out with Representative Leah Howell from the 82nd District. Leah, welcome to committee.
Thank you, Chair and Vice Chair and committee members. Just really quickly, I know you have my testimony in front of you. I just want to point out really quickly that there has been frequent confusion about this being for housing, and I want to clarify that this is absolutely not for housing in any way. It is purely about homeless infrastructure shelters only. And I want to draw your attention particularly to page 2 of my testimony. It talks about what the bill as its current requirements have, and then amendments that we are working, at least some of the amendments we are working on the House side and committee. I do want to address that, I drafted this bill. My intention is that for this to be for permanent shelters, not temporary shelters. So I think I'll be clarifying that. So thank you for bringing that forward. I just want to point out, we all know that our homeless population and the number of encampments are increasing across our state. It's becoming more of a problem. We have little girls being raped and murdered. We have homeless people being murdered in our encampments. It's unacceptable. We know that there is a cost to doing nothing, and ignoring the problem doesn't make it go away. Currently, the homeless population is already a high utilizer of government services. Fire, police, EMS, jails, mental health, government-owned mental health crisis centers are constantly dealing with homeless people that are in the middle of a crisis because they're not getting regular treatment for their mental health. There are good examples of homeless programs that are working in numerous places across the country and even in our state. They include effective homeless services and treatment combined with shelters and locally enforced encampment rules. I think the combination of these things are really key in helping get these high utilizers back to becoming contributing members of our society and no longer being those high utilizers. I also want to just make sure that you understand there is not federal funding available for shelter infrastructures. So as Kansans, I believe we can do better, and this bill gives us an opportunity to reset what we're doing across our state and provide effective solutions moving forward. And with that, I'll stand for questions.
Thank you. Questions? Senator Pittman.
I'll call your attention to the top of page 3 and appreciate the quote. As a Republican, I view addressing homelessness as a moral imperative and a pro-life issue. I'll echo that as a Democrat. I view addressing homelessness as a moral imperative and a pro-life issue as well. So appreciate that.
Other questions? Seeing none, thank you, Representative. Oh, Senator Petty.
So, Representative, thanks for being here, but I know you made the comment, and I know it's not in the bill, but you did make the comment that you're thinking about another amendment that would not allow temporary shelters. So it seems that we've heard when in past discussions that particularly with small communities and maybe even my own community, that this kind of as available funding with a one-to-one match could be used for those type of facilities, but you're envisioning this as just being new build?
No, I'm not saying that it would be new build. I'm just saying like a tent or, a temporary structure. And this is intended to be funding the actual infrastructure, not the running of a program, not any of the services that are being provided within that program. But so like if you put up a tent for a warming shelter temporarily in the winter, then that would be a temporary solution, not a long-term permanent solution. And I drafted this with the intention for long-term permanent solutions to our homeless problem.
Senator Petty.
I see what you're saying. I do think in some communities that there are expansion of what they already have, which would not be necessarily permanent, would be to meet the needs for a period of time.
Other questions? Would you like to respond?
I would just say that, if it's a real structure that we're building or improving on, then I don't think that I necessarily disagree with your point. I'm just saying not a like a tent kind of thing.
Other questions? Seeing none, thank you, Representative. Next, we'll have Amy Campbell, Kansas Mental Health Coalition. Amy, welcome committee. Okay, we'll take hers as written unless she shows up. Okay, next we'll have Troy Anderson, City of Wichita, WebEx. Troy, are you on WebEx?
I am. Thank you so much for the opportunity, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. My name is Troy Anderson, the Assistant City Manager here for the City of Wichita. We have provided some written testimony, but I wanted to just elaborate a little bit. Yes, the plight of homelessness in Wichita and in cities across the state is real. We actually have some really good data. We'd love to share it with you. One of the biggest challenges, however, is a lack of infrastructure. And as Representative Howell alluded to, there's a lack of funding opportunities to invest in that infrastructure. Over the last 2 years, though, we have engaged professionals both locally and across the nation to develop a plan based on best practices. We've engaged folks from Haven of Hope in San Antonio. We've engaged Julie Orlando with Bergen County, New Jersey. And over the last year in particular, we have onboarded a development partner to engage our local community partners, our service providers in this space of providing homeless services. And we have developed a project scope that does include a navigation center to provide those wraparound services, to also provide congregate, non-congregate shelter space, in addition to low-income housing. The project size and scope is based on a needs analysis. So we've custom tailored the size and scope of the project for local needs. Even though as the largest city in the state, we have the largest concentration of homelessness. And so obviously the size and scope of our project is going to be probably wildly different than a number of communities across the state. With that being said, we ask for your support for this bill. Infrastructure support for congregate, non-congregate shelter, our capital stack. We've identified a number of funding sources to provide for the navigation center and for the low-income housing, but our biggest gap is in regards to that congregate, non-congregate shelter space. We're also probably best positioned for a local match. We have a number of dollars currently anticipated to be about $20 million that we could provide as part of a local match. And then obviously we are working diligently to enforce our codes and ordinances, particularly around encampments. And so again, we just asked for your support today. I wanted to make sure that we keep this brief. And so with that being said, I'll stand for questions.
Thank you, Troy. Questions? Senator Petty.
Troy, thanks for your testimony. I was just curious because I was looking at another testimony. Do you have the point in time numbers for 23 for Wichita?
No,
for homelessness?
Yes. Sorry, the point in time count for 2023 has yet to be released. We expect that probably June or July for that number to be re-released. I can tell you in 2022, that number was over 700. And in 2022, we had over 45 individuals who perished as a result of a lack of homelessness.
Thank you.
Other questions? Troy, I guess I'd have excuse me, Senator Fagg.
No, go ahead.
No.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Troy, thank you. I was wondering that, like on the city of Wichita, do you have any nonprofits that's helping with this issue? Part of me saying when government gets involved with something like this, sometimes nonprofits would be a good way. And I know some like in Butler County that's been working on this, where people can donate and it's a good church activity, some things along those areas. Once the city gets involved and we're back to brick and mortar, and we just talked about that, that's one question. The other one that I might ask is like Sedgwick County, when we talk about one-for-one match, I'm thinking a city ought to be involved in a county. The question is why the state gets involved. You know, that's kind of my question. Thank you.
Yeah, so I'll answer that in the context of, yes, we have a number of local service providers who we have been engaging and we've been visiting with and coordinating with, right? We approach this from the perspective of this is a one-time infrastructure capital outlay, right? It's building out the facility. The city has no intention of operating the facility, right? That's where we're going to come alongside our local partners and help through facilitating not only the space, but ongoing support funds for operation. But we've engaged a number of local businesses, the faith-based community, as well as our nonprofit community, for those folks to come in and operate within the space. But this is just an effort to build out that space. This is a one-time infrastructure capital outlay. So with that being said, yes, between the city and the county is also engaged. We're having really good conversations with the county about ongoing support. But when you talk about sort of that faith-based nonprofit community out there, right, there truly is a lack of infrastructure dollars available. And so where we're finding the balance is those organizations being able to provide the ongoing long-term operation and service that the homeless are in need of.
Other questions? Troy, I might ask, so your count in 2022 was 700. What do you have any anticipation in 23? I'm assuming it's increasing. Has it gone down any, or how do you perceive that?
Sure, I can kind of try to bridge the gap a little bit. Over the last several years, we continue to see that point in time count number continue to rise. We don't know, as I indicated, we probably won't know what that number is until June or July, but I can tell you our emergency winter shelter over the last 100+ days, right? We have seen over 1,000 individuals come through our emergency winter shelter over the last several months. And so I would imagine that that point in time count number will probably be somewhere between that 700 and 1,000.
And are most of these folks without shelter from the Wichita area, or are you getting transit folks, or do you know on that?
Yeah, probably the best answer to that is primarily these are folks in Wichita. However, regionally, Wichita is a community that provides those services. So there may be folks who are coming from the region to Wichita to receive those support services. But primarily, the numbers that we're talking about are primarily folks who are in Wichita. But yes, that number continues to grow because folks from around the region are coming to Wichita because we're one of the only communities that provide these wraparound services.
Thank you. Any other questions? Senator Fagg.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In the Wichita area, do you have any like empty nursing homes or any city buildings that's empty that you could, besides building something new, is there anything old that we could refurbish and work with that way? Just a thought.
Yeah, no, absolutely. We, in fact, over the last year, as I indicated, we onboarded a development partner. We went through a very rigorous concept plan as well as real estate evaluation. We have identified 6 available real estate opportunities, subsequently ranked them. And so we have identified 2 sites right now and have secured options on those properties. One is an existing community asset, a former hospital that we are doing due diligence on right now. I also know that we are beginning to branch out. We weren't privy to this until a couple of weeks ago, right? But there are a number of elementary schools in the community that USD 259 has recently decided to dispose of. And so one is in close proximity to an existing service provider. And we are beginning to do the due diligence on whether or not that is an opportunity to respond to this from a capital outlay. But until we know more about that, at this point in time, we have identified 2 locations, secured options, and are currently going through due diligence. We've conducted, or we're in the process of conducting environmental assessment, as well as continuing to just zero in on what the capital and operational costs are going to look like on those 2 sites.
Any other questions? Seeing none, thank you, Troy. Appreciate your being here today. Next, we'll have Alan Housey, Unified Government of Wyandotte City and Kansas City, Kansas. Alan, welcome committee.
All right, thank you, Mr. Chairman, members. I'll keep it brief as well. I think a lot of what Troy said is applicable. They're a little further along in their planning process. We are also looking at what a permanent shelter could look like. I'll note, as I did in my testimony, that our point in time count for in 2019 was 81. That's gone up over 50% in 2023 to 125 people. The most recent point in time count was January 24th and 25th of this year, so that'll be the 24 count. So as we're talking about numbers, just to clarify that. But we know that that significantly undercounts. We had 400 unique contacts for one of our service providers in 2023. And we also know that some of the changes that were made in Missouri have also resulted in an increase in folks who are showing up in Wyandotte County and KCK. We know that this issue crosses borders of cities and counties and now even states. And that has really kind of put a significant strain on our local ability to respond. And that's why for the first time this year, our commission put in a request as part of our state legislative agenda for support from the state to assist in addressing this, because we know it's not just a local issue. So we do appreciate the legislatures having that consideration. As noted, we don't have a permanent homeless shelter. We do open a severe winter shelter. So that just closed. We had 15 nights this year where it dropped below the temperature threshold, and 153 people that came through that shelter. We also know that that was life-saving, particularly when we had experiences like we did in January with that really severe cold. And we also know that there's kind of mix of chronic homelessness, which is about 25% of homeless population, but then there's another 75% veterans, foster kids, and others. So trying to take a broader look at how can we begin to address that and chip away at those areas in this really complex problem. So we, again, appreciate that and happy to stand for any questions.
Thank you, Alan. Questions? Senator Petty.
Alan, thanks for being here. Senator Fagg mentioned this before, and as I was looking at some other testimony, I know Johnson County has acquired two, a former motel and a former grocery store, I think it is, that they have already moved in that direction. So as a unified government, looking at any potential buildings that are already vacant that might be available?
Yeah, so that's kind of that mix of, are there, whether it's a former motel or hotel, or is it is it cheaper to do a pole barn type of structure? So I think that kind of mix of, can we reuse existing buildings that are available, or should we, if we go down this route, build something new? Sometimes that reuse can be more expensive than starting something that's kind of basic from scratch, but those still be determined as we build out a more robust plan.
Just follow up, does the unified government still have their homeless coalition? Are you just part of the Greater Kansas City?
We are part of the Greater Kansas City COC, and so we're a combined COC, and there is a task force that the mayor's put together on homelessness that has brought together service providers that are working on this issue. We met, in fact, just yesterday to try and bring forward ideas and approaches, and we also, as Mr. Anderson noted, taking advantage of some of the resources that are external to the UG, national resources that have best practices that we can bring to bear on this locally, but also, again, trying to solve it regionally within the Kansas City region.
I'll just say that as a commissioner, I served on the local. We did have a Wyandotte County Homeless Coalition at that time, but also on the Marks Coalition as well. Thank you for being here.
Other questions? Senator Fagg.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for your presentation. Wyandotte County, what's the population of that? You say you've identified 125 here. Just trying to get an idea of
overall
population. Yes.
For the KCK, it's about 163,000 or so total population. County's a little bit larger than that.
Do you take, if you know there's 125 people, does anybody ever talk to them or find out whether they're locals, whether they're non-locals?
Yes.
Anybody ever check to see if they're illegal?
So we do have nonprofits that are involved in outreach, and that's where that 400 number that I mentioned earlier, this contrast between the point in time count and what we actually see coming through the doors. We do have teams that go out, or nonprofits do, that go out and reach out to folks. And a lot of them are, from KCK. And, again, for the very variety of reasons that people fall into homelessness. whether that's job loss or illness or foster care. Again, there's a broad spectrum there. And I think they see all of that in the numbers that exist in KCK.
Senator Clays.
Mr. Chairman, does the shelter allow individuals to stay the night who are under the influence of alcohol or drugs?
I believe not. So there's a 25-degree threshold. If it's colder than that, that's when it opens. If somebody comes in and they're obviously, under the influence or otherwise unwell, then they'll take steps to provide proper placement for them.
Thank you.
Other questions? Seeing none, thank you, Alan. Appreciate you being here today. Next, we'll have Jessica Lucas, City of Liberal. Jessica, welcome committee.
Good morning, committee. Jessica Lucas for the City of Liberal. I want to provide a micro view of this issue. The City of Liberal appreciates that this money was added to the budget and is being discussed today. Some of you have heard me talk about the needs that they have. Essentially, what this funding would mean for them, they have the only 90-day shelter in Southwest Kansas. They do not have folks in encampments, and they certainly want to keep it that way. But this money is really an answer to the community's prayers because they have a need for an expansion into a commercial kitchen, which is not only serving food to the homeless, but also is the community soup kitchen, as well as infrastructure upgrades, including roof repair and HVAC repair. So this really is important to them. They are doing a lot of things in the community to help serve the homeless. Their facility, as I said, is the only one in Southwest Kansas. It is a place where often folks are staying as they then earn a living, are taking the bus to jobs, and within those 90 days then have the resources to be able to get a home there in the community. The shelter does not allow for individuals to present that are under the influence, and see this again just as an opportunity. I appreciate your consideration of, again, the micro piece of this. I know we're talking about larger communities that have bigger needs and bigger asks, but for them, this is very impactful dollars, and we would hope to see it funded.
Questions for Jessica? Senator Alley.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Do you think that based on Southwest Kansas, do you see a need in our smaller communities in Southwest Kansas also?
So they are really serving, they are the overflow, right? If Dodge and Garden have issues and cannot accommodate, they're coming to Liberal. Our hope is, and what Liberal hopes, is that they don't have to, that they're not overwhelmed. They can continue to serve the need as they've been able to do, but have some limitations and aren't then pushing them into other cities. Their goal and the wraparound services that they provide are to try and help people that need help, in addition to those folks that are literally there until they have the money to get their own place. Some folks are presenting with more issues than just needing to work long enough to earn money and have a deposit and such.
Other questions? Senator Pittman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Jessica, for being here and presenting Liberal. Liberal's situation sounds very similar to Leavenworth's situation. It's a town of, say, 25,000, depending on who you count. But they have a very similar thing where they don't accept folks that are presenting kind of under the influence. They have wraparound services. It's all volunteer run and all funded by the churches and donations. One of the things I'd say is that it does bring in folks from around the community for the smaller towns that might not be able to invest in a real shelter that this is trying to get. So it actually provides a service for a region much in the same way it sounds like Liberal does, so that maybe the town of Tonganoxie doesn't have to invest $1 million or $500,000 into this. So I like the amendment that you proposed, that maybe we'd carve out some of this, that maybe 20 million is a lot of money going to Wichita. I don't know what the right amount is, but is there a suggested amount that you'd be looking for towns like?
I mean, ultimately, I think it depends on the dollars that you have allocated, and there's a lot of needs to try and serve. But some consideration for these smaller communities who also have less ability to tap into other resources, I think, is an important part of this. And certainly support the effort by the larger communities as well. But we do think that that's an important consideration for the smaller regions.
Thank you.
Other questions? Senator Fagg.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Jessica, for your presentation. What's the population of Liberal, and do you have a number of how many homeless is there? Somehow they can count that.
I do not have a number of how many homeless they have. I just know that they do not have any encampments or a circumstance where you visibly see the homeless. The county of Seward is under 20,000, I believe.
Other questions? Seeing none, thank you, Jessica.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Next, we'll have Andrew Brown, Kansas Department of Aging Disability Service. Andrew, welcome committee.
Thank you, Chairman Billinger, members of the committee. I just wanted to stand today to express our strong support for Senate Bill 542. We believe that homelessness is a multifaceted issue. We feel like KDADS has a role in that because of the number of people that are homeless and are disabled or are suffering from mental health or substance use disorders. We commend the proposed funding for shelters outlined in Senate Bill 542. We also urge the committee to consider broadening the scope of the bill to include infrastructure development for all parts of the housing service continuum. There's a group I belong to, and we have a saying that goes, half measures avail does nothing. I do feel like shelters are a very important piece of the continuum of services, but there's also needs for infrastructure and transitional housing and other housing support programs to help people move into permanent housing. So we have recommendations listed in my written testimony. Those are in bold just so that they can be clearly identified quickly. But the main one is really to look at expanding the funding eligibility to allow funding for infrastructure development, not only for shelters, but also those critical components of housing services continuum, such as transitional housing, permanent supportive housing, and affordable housing initiatives. We urge the committee to support Senate Bill 542 and consider recommendations outlined in my testimony. And we also do want to point out that this was originally included in the governor's budget recommendations as a line item in the budget, which accomplishes the same outcome. Approving the aforementioned budget enhancement ensures that these funds can be distributed in a timelier manner. Thank you for your time.
Questions for Andrew? Senator Fagg.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for your presentation, Andrew. I was wondering, you've been around this conversation enough. How did they arrive at 40 million?
So I think the original request that came through the governor's office was for a $50 million amount. We took a quick kind of purview of what was going on and felt like $40 million was probably a more reasonable amount to include in the budget.
Any other questions? Senator Alley.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Is there any thought on, should this be, we have a problem in our metropolitan areas, but we also have a problem in our rural areas. Is there any thought on saying 20% of that money should go to our rural areas, and rural being under, I think somebody said 30,000 population in the county? Is there any thought to that?
Well, so when we talked about this on the House side, one of the things that we brought up is the fact that when we're looking at a funding mechanism for this, we're going to be putting out an RFA, which will allow communities to apply for those funds in a competitive manner, right? So we'll be able to look at what their needs assessment are for their community, look at what the size of their scope of their problem is, and then make a reasonable estimate about what those needed costs are for their projects. And then we can compare those and rate those and make a determination. So right now, there's nothing in the bill that sets aside a specific amount for a smaller amount. I've had conversations with several folks from smaller communities about making sure that there's a way to structure that grant application in a way that awards consideration for smaller projects.
Other questions? Senator Fagg.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Is there, as far as the funding goes, could a nonprofit apply for this too?
No.
It has to be a government entity that does that.
That's correct.
Okay.
Any other questions, Senator Pittman?
Following up, Mr. Chair, on that question, sometimes a town, a city, or a county can invest in a nonprofit.
Yes.
That's possible?
Yes. So, I mean, this is an example. The city could apply for funding, which they would then manage, and they could do a sub-grant to the nonprofit if there's a need for the nonprofit to handle the construction costs.
Any other questions? Seeing none, thank you, Andrew. Committee, I'll point out we have written only Mental Health America of South Central Kansas and of the Heartland, Becky Gray Community Health Center of Southeast Kansas, Jay Leipzig, Johnson County, Sedgwick County Commissioners, Jason Watkins, the Wichita Regional Chamber of Commerce. Are there any opponents? Seeing none, we'll move on to neutral. We have Kayla Kiner of Kansas Statewide Homeless Coalition on WebEx. Kayla, are you there?
Hi, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes, and you'll need to be very brief. We still have a few more and we're about out of time.
Okay. So my name is Kayla Kinnear. I actually live in Garden City, Kansas, but I work for the Kansas Statewide Homeless Coalition. So keeping it brief from the conversation today, I think what's really important is changing the one-to-one match so that rural and frontier counties have an opportunity to apply for these funds. So maybe being able to allow for federal grants to be used as match, as well as in-kind donations should be added to the bill. Also for infrastructure, although some, in rural counties and frontier counties, infrastructure is great. We definitely need new shelters and improvement for the shelters that we already have. But if we don't expand the eligibility of use for this bill, we're really just going to create silos to emergency shelter without providing anywhere for anyone to go afterwards. So I think the National Low Income Housing Coalition just this month published that for Kansas, for every 100 low income renters, there's only 41 affordable and available housing units. So that's really important to keep in mind. Once we get these people into shelter and off the street, where are they going to go afterwards? So it would be good to leave some of the decision about how the money should be spent up to the communities. Last and most importantly, the language regarding enforcing camping and vagrancy laws. So that language ties grant eligibility to law enforcement actions, and that could be troublesome for future funding. So any of the nonprofits and the COCs that are working to end homelessness in Kansas, they usually are funded by federal HUD funds. So you would basically make these programs ineligible to receive federal HUD funds by tying it to laws that require criminalization of homelessness. So for any shelter wanting to be sustainable, either that city's going to have to be able to sustain them financially because they won't be eligible for any federal funds. I'm available for questions.
Okay, well, thank you. Any questions for Kayla? Seeing none, thank you, Kayla. Next, we'll have Matthew Falk, Kansas Balance of State Continuum of Care on WebEx. Matthew, are you there?
Hello, I am. Can you hear me?
We can, if you'd keep it brief, please.
Will do. Chairman Billinger, members of the Senate Committee on Ways and Means, thank you very much. I'm presenting testimony on behalf of the Kansas Balance of State Continuum of Care. I'm a part of that steering committee and leadership team. The Kansas Balance of State represents 101 mostly rural counties across the community and helps coordinate homeless services in those communities. There are 3 points we make in our testimony. One is that, the challenge that we face as a state and as a nation took several decades. It's taken decades to get us to this point. One-time funding is not sufficient. It'll take ongoing funding to make the impact that I know you have intended with this funding. That impact will not result from one-time funding. Two, in respect to mandated law enforcement, that will have unintended consequences because it doesn't really address the migratory problems that exist within the homeless community. People within the homeless community tend to migrate to regions of the state that have or are perceived to have better resources and or are more friendly to their population. And that includes forced migration, where a region will ship people to another region in the state. Those regions who are destination regions have no control over that. And mandated enforcement will create an unintended problem for their local jurisdictions and their judicial systems and create an undue burden on their local taxpayers to pay for that. And then our other comment is to make the funds need to be more flexible, and they need to be able to be aligned with local needs in respect to what those local regions find to be necessary for them to address the issue. You know, the rural communities need different approaches than urban communities, and so funds need to be able to align with them differently across the regions of the state. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Was there any questions for Matthew? Seeing none. Next, we'll have Andrew Weens, Cicero Action.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My name is Andrew Weens with Dugan Consulting Group, and I'm speaking today on behalf of Cicero Action. Cicero Action's views on homelessness are born out of a desire to reduce street homelessness, and that's in contrast with the results of failed policies promulgated in urban areas across the country that have resulted in more and more spending on homeless services for worse and worse results. We're neutral on this bill. That's because we have some ideas for you. So first off, we believe additional funding to support the building of shelters, capital improvements to those shelters for the homeless is a good thing, but that must be paired with strong policy reforms to ensure those dollars are not squandered. We believe the newfound need for these dollars, from the state at least, is in part a consequence of the failed Housing First policy. I won't go through the statistics, but at the bottom of page 2 of my testimony, it talks about one place in the country that has embraced the federal Housing First policy statewide. California actually passed a law in 2016 saying that all state and local homeless policies must follow Housing First, and they've seen a dramatic rise in homelessness. We also think Housing First has decimated shelter capacity in this state and across the country because Housing First focuses continuum of care dollars away from shelters and instead toward transitional and permanent supportive housing. We're aware of some domestic violence shelters that have lost funding because they no longer qualify under the COC model. And Wichita, there was an article in Wichita, the continuum of care said the federal government allots Wichita about $2.8 million annually to put toward ending homelessness and helping with housing needs like rental assistance. But none of it can be used for emergency shelters. Those dollars are centered on the philosophy of Housing First. So let me get to some of our suggestions. So while the bill contains some homelessness policy reforms aimed at grant recipients, we believe we have to appropriately strengthen those policies and apply them statewide. We think that absent a broader requirement that all localities in Kansas enact and enforce street camping bans, this grant program will create a moving target for the subset of homeless population that doesn't want treatment or services and would rather camp on the streets. And as you've heard other conferees say, there is a subset of the homeless population that fits in that category. So a policy environment that creates pockets of the state where enforcement is occurring, which would be the grant recipients under this bill, could lead to other pockets of the state, like suburbs or nearby towns, where this subset of the homeless population will relocate. So we may end up with kind of a street camping balloon. When it's pushed on one side, it expands on another. You've heard this before today, but street camps are dangerous to the public and the vulnerable homeless alike. It is not compassionate to let the homeless stay on the streets, either for the homeless individuals themselves who may have substance use or mental health problems, may or may not, or for the general public whose lives are endangered, properties damaged, and public spaces degraded by that state of affairs. We also suggest that you look at changing this bill to allow a person to bring a writ of mandamus for a violation of the enforcement provisions. This would be a legal avenue that could compel government officials to properly fulfill their duties as provided by law if they're not doing so. A writ of mandamus is an attempt to provide taxpayers with a reasonable way to enforce the enforcement, if you will. And then it was discussed by a previous conferee, but we believe it's also time to address the problem of homeless individuals being transported by government officials from one jurisdiction within the state to another. So you could consider including language to prevent localities from dropping homeless individuals off in another locality within Kansas unless there's a warm handoff or they're from there or something like that. And finally, I would thank you for all the work you've done to address mental health and substance abuse treatment in the state. Many homeless people suffer from chronic and untreated mental illness, and for those that are a public nuisance or a danger to themselves, we have to provide another option besides prison and abandonment. So there's a bill that House or Senate Judiciary heard this morning. The House has already passed House Bill 2353 that would help address that with assistant outpatient treatment. So with that, I thank you for the opportunity to submit testimony. I'll stand for questions, Mr.
Thank you, Andrew. Any questions? Seeing none. Thank you, Andrew. Next, we'll have Christina Gundry, United Community Services of Johnson County on WebEx. Christina, are you on there?
I am. Thank you. Can you hear me?
We can, so if you'd be brief, I'd appreciate it.
I will. So we actually serve as the continuum of care lead for Johnson County. And so we coordinate the private and public partners that deliver services to address housing insecurity and homelessness. You also have testimony from Johnson County government as well as other COCs. We would like to point out that there are systemic reasons that we have seen an increase in homelessness in Kansas over the past several years. Those include that Kansas has an growing affordable housing shortage that's been documented by KHRC. Our rents in Kansas are actually outpacing rental increases in other states. And nearly 30% of our population are considered low income. So when you combine those three factors together, that leads to an increase in homelessness, including unsheltered homelessness. We are neutral regarding this bill. While this $40 million is really critical, we have a couple of comments. The first is that we really think that localities, you've heard from several COCs, are crafting their own responses and have their own needs, which look different in different parts of the state. And so we would ask that localities be allowed to apply for the type of housing infrastructure that they need. And so we would ask you to expand the types of housing infrastructure these dollars can be used on, and also prioritize a portion of funding for rural areas. So while Johnson County, for example, is in the process of building an additional emergency shelter, other regions lack transitional housing or rapid rehousing or domestic violence shelters. So we want to make sure that the right type of housing infrastructure can be accessed by different parts of the state. Second, we would ask that you remove the Section 2B6 enforcement of local camping and vagrancy ordinances. The shelters that would be supported by this will not provide enough capacity to house every unsheltered household in Kansas. And so really this section just becomes a violation of local control. Our localities are keenly aware of this need. You can see that in their testimony, and each of them has developed their own local response that is continuing to evolve and that is accountable to their own taxpayers. So we want them to use their law enforcement and their local responses in cost-efficient ways. If you are ticketing individuals or arresting them because they have nowhere to go, it's very expensive to use our law enforcement and our justice system and our local government that way. And then we're just returning the same folks back out into our public spaces without having connected them to any services or housing supports. That also creates legal liability for our cities, particularly when you think about a writ of mandamus. The U.S. Supreme Court has ruled to overturn vagrancy and loitering ordinances, and they're taking up a camping ordinance ban now. And so requiring localities to kind of enforce that, what might be already bad law, creates legal liability for them. So finally, we'd ask that you add a severability clause to ensure that the goal of this to provide housing infrastructure support to address homelessness is met, even if another section is struck down. And I'm happy to stand for any questions.
Questions? Seeing none. Thank you, Christina. Appreciate you being here today. Committee, I'll also point out we have written only from Christina McMurphy, Rob Santel, Coalition of Endless Homeless in Wichita and Sedgwick, and Aaron Melton, Kansas Action for Children. Anyone else here that wanted to testify? Seeing none, no more. At this time, we will close our hearing on House Bill or Senate Bill 542. Committee, that concludes our work for today. We are adjourned.